the co-director of the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics and an affiliate professor at Sciences Po. Lucas Chancel is an economist who specializes in inequality and environmental policy. His work focuses on the measurement of economic inequality, its interactions with sustainable development, on the implementation of social and ecological policies. Coverage of his research can be found in Science, Nature, The Guardian, The Financial Times, The New York Times, CNN, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, El País, among many others. And Luca will be in conversation with Albena Asmanova, who is a tenured associate professor of political and social theory at the University of Kent's Brussels Schools of International Studies. Oof, so a long title. The author of The Scandal of Reason, A Critical Theory of Political Judgment from 2012. Albena has served as political advisor for the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and the European Parliament, among other institutions. Can we have a round of applause, please, for Albena and Luca? Thank you. So as I kind of weigh into your book, Albena, I'd like to read a kind of opening, very brief paragraph, which is to say that your book is in many ways a daring and unapologetic intervention in a post-2008 financial crisis leftism. Your book has been described as offering a radical alternative to traditional anti-capitalist narratives, which place inequality at the center of their critiques. And since we have Luca here with us this evening to kind of paradoxically defend the critique of inequality, I do think we should first assault it. So please tell us, although you concede in your book that inequality certainly is important and is a problem, why is it not the problem, capital P, of our age? And why is precarity the problem? And how would you define precarity?
Well, thank you. I appreciate you all coming here to discuss the troubles of the 99%. But let me approach this issue in a different way. So when I was a student in New York in the 1990s, I picked up the unshakable habit of reading the New Yorker. Or if I didn't have much time, at least to ponder the front cover. And the front covers of the New Yorkers really capture the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist. Probably better than some of the hefty readings I had to plow through as a doctoral student. So remember the 1990s, the most prosperous decade of the 20th century. Working life especially was great at the time in Europe and America. Low unemployment, steady growth, a sense of limitless opportunity, and even fun. And some of the covers of the New Yorker that I dug out really capture that. If you can see here, so our office life was supposed to be a merry-go-round. Digitalization allowed us to escape the office and still do our jobs by the sea. We would, create all these smart contraptions in our garages and become millionaires. Even office romance was celebrated, not nowadays. So basically, everybody had a jolly good time. So the optimism of the 90s was quite remarkable. And then strange things started to happen. Populist movements started mobilizing at the end of the 20th century, in the late 90s, in conditions of peaceful prosperity. So much before the economic crisis. That's often forgotten. That's one puzzle. The other puzzle is that when the economic crisis hit in 2008 and brought in all this talk about terminal crisis of capitalism, capitalism on its deathbed. Remember, President Sarkozy was photographed reading Marx's Capital. So yet, that crisis, deep as it was, did not provoke the radical left-wing insurgency that progressive forces had hoped for. On the contrary, the support for the far right continued to grow. So not left-wing, right-wing insurgency. And most recently, the protracted pandemic. Just think about it. Our societies are so affluent, they're scientifically advanced, politically sophisticated. We can measure gravitational waves in the fabric of space-time. My son who studied physics tells me. We can alter the human genome, and yet we have trouble coping with a virus that is neither very deadly nor completely unknown. So the book addresses or gives an answer to such puzzles. So I tell the story of a pervasive weakening of our societies over at least the last 20 years. The development of a pathological state that I call massive precarity, which is a condition of economic, political, and psychological fragilization, weakening, instability. Now, the COVID pandemic was in fact preceded by and prepared by what I can only describe as a pandemic of precarity. So the interesting thing is that this condition of precarity does not affect only those in insecure jobs and poorly paid jobs. You know, there are authors like Guy Standing who has spoken about the precarious class. Now I say we have a precarious multitude because those who are suffering precarity are also, you know, the well-educated, highly skilled, well-paid professionals. So precarity is creeping up to the very top of the social hierarchy. We hear this you know, almost fantastic stories about young bankers at Goldman Sachs begging to have their working week capped at 80 hours and lawyers burnout. So this is, in my reading, this is what troubles the 99%. And they have the right to worry, indeed. So let me just address 3 of the consequences of precarity. Why do we need to recognize it as the greatest social evil of our time? Now, one of the consequences is that precarity makes people conservative, even reactionary. So they're afraid of change, even when change is badly needed. Second, it undermines solidarity. As everyone is out to save their own neck, the middle classes no longer care about the poor. The working classes are once again, you know, afraid of immigrants who are supposedly there to take their jobs. Various minorities are competing for victimhood because this is the most sure path for some social protection. And what I find especially worrying, that precarity is politically debilitating. What I mean is that when it directs our efforts towards finding and securing a source of income, this leaves neither the time nor the energy for us to be engaged in larger battles for the type of life that we want to live. So surely making us all more equal within a deeply unjust system is something to try to do. This is better than spreading the injustice unevenly. But as we're at it, we might try to do better than that. You know, I think the time is right for a more radical and more meaningful change. And moreover, this change in our context can be done without a terrible crisis, without a bloody revolution, and without some glamorous utopia. And the book actually addresses some of the measures, it gives some ideas of how we can make this happen.
Right, and we're gonna talk about the solutions, and we're gonna cast aside the glamorous utopias. Before we turn to Luca, I would just, so we're all clear and kind of on the same page here, you mentioned a kind of overworked lawyer, you mentioned a rich but unhappy banker. Can you kind of give us some more tangible examples of where precarity comes up in life, since in your opinion it affects the 99%. So where else might we see it in day-to-day life? What does it look like?
Yeah, very good idea. So in those students, I'm a professor at the university, those students who come to me for their third and fourth master's degree because they cannot find a job. So even students from very elite institutions are worried that they cannot get a job. Even in the, my son who studies physics is afraid that the only place he can find employment is the stock exchange.
Which would lead to more precarity.
Yeah. So the young generation is very much affected by that. Then people in permanently chasing, applying for jobs. It's an illusion that there's employment for everybody if you have a good education.
Okay, fantastic. Luca, so Albena has kind of painted a picture, a narrative over the last 2-3 decades leading up to kind of culmination of a precarious moment. Could we write the same narrative from the point of view of inequality? And if so, what would it look like?
Thanks for the question and for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. So good evening, everybody. I'll answer the question. Perhaps I just say a few words about my first reading of this book and my how I got introduced to it. So I hadn't read the book, and basically I got to read the title first and a few reviews about the book, and I understood that potentially there would be a big clash between the book and what I work on, what I analyze, and my understanding of current day capitalism. And I was gifted the book by Albena, and thank you very much for that. It was a great read, so I really encourage you to read it. I think it's a very exciting book, and in fact, there were 3 moments for me in this reading of the book as compared to how I see capitalism and inequality. And the first moment was, okay, well, actually, I don't see where the clash is. I agree with what is there. So sorry, no clash tonight.
So half the room leaves.
Okay, so what do we agree on? Basically, the fact that in politics, in economics, over the past 40 years, we tend to forget about really thinking about the economy and about power structures in the economy, which create discontent in the population. And I think Albena makes it very clear that center-right politics and center-left politics tended to forget about what really people deeply care about, what makes the good life, and to provide solutions for that. Basically, parties in government were not doing this anymore over the past 40 years. So deep agreement with that. Another deep agreement with, there's an easy way and sometimes perhaps a lazy way to look at populist movements and to say, well, these are populists, we should not listen to them. And in fact, whatever they say should be disregarded. Also broad agreement with that. I think populism is a lazy term, and we need to go further in our understanding of what it is. But now let me turn to the disagreements.
Right, because you don't study precarity, you study inequality.
Absolutely. So. And where the disagreement comes from is that I think a big part of the book is about trying to say that we should not care about inequality, we should care about precarity. And in fact, I think that we should basically care about both, because extreme inequality creates precarity. And because if we look and if we study the return of inequality with my colleagues, Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and this vast group of scholars over the world with whom I work with, it's because the return of extreme inequality. So if we look, societies now, they are much more unequal than they were 40 years back. And 40 years back, they were much more equal than they were 40 years before. So there is this, U curve of inequality. It was high 100 years back, it decreased after the world wars, and then it rose back again. Why do we study that? Well, because there's an association between more precarity and high inequality. Why? Because, Warren Buffett, and I think this could be a line, a quote. There are also very nice quotes in the book at the beginning of each chapter, and I think this also makes the read pretty enjoyable. There's one quote I didn't read there, but I think I wanted to share it with you. It's by Warren Buffett. You know Warren Buffett, so US billionaire, so owner of Berkshire Hathaway, and he says, so of course there's a class war. There is a class struggle and a class war, and it's my class, the billionaire class, that won the war. And he was saying this line while he was having an interview with the New York Times reporter, and he was looking at the amount of taxes that he was paying as compared to the taxes paid by his secretaries and people with a little income working for him. He was looking at the inequality in tax rates. And he was saying, well, there's a problem here. And in fact, the system is rigged, and the system will lead to even more concentration of power and wealth and power. So there's this vicious cycle between more economic inequality and more power inequality. And this translates into more precarity. Why? Because in order to attack precarity, to address it, well, you need basic access to education, basic access to health, good training. You also need minimum wages. And I think we agree on that with Albena, but where I would like to basically point out a different is where I think that this is partly due to the return of extreme inequality, which makes addressing these things more difficult because there is less funding for that, for the reason that Warren Buffett was describing when he was comparing his tax rate with the tax rate of his secretaries.
So you would say, yes, we should address precarity, but a prerequisite to addressing precarity is to address inequality.
Inequality today means precarity tomorrow.
Great. Another line, another quote. What would you say to that,
Okay,
Albena?
I will disagree with that, probably because I grew up in a relatively equal society, and the communist regime in Bulgaria that was very precarious. So I would say, yes, inequality, as we have experienced it in the West, leads to terrible things like poor health, higher rates of imprisonment, poor mental health, etc. But so did equality. So it seems to me that this is not the problem. So with a similar, let me be a little bit provocative, but could I then say that under communism, the high rates of imprisonment and mistrust in society and poor mental health were a result of equality? Sure, that would be preposterous. It was a result of the political oppression. So we imagine, make this thought experiment. We can redistribute everything, let's say all the wealth, we can build perfectly equal societies, but they might be very precarious if we do not invest in healthcare, in education. So if we don't take care of the commons. And what troubles me in the discourse about equality is that it is not a real negation of the brutal capitalistic logic of neoliberal capitalism, because neoliberal capitalism focuses on individual responsibilities, on individual circumstances. And where we talk about inequalities, we compare individuals, we compare individual incomes, we compare individual circumstances. And what we forget exactly that socialists have always thought it's important, the commons. I mean, it's curious that even Marx did not believe in equality. The main value of socialism is solidarity, not equality. If you remember the principle of justice he formulates for communism, it is from each according to their capacity to each according to their need. This is not equality. Actually, Marx has written a very angry statement against Proudhon about equalization, wage equalization. He says this can be achieved only through violence, and he was against violence. So what I'm appealing is to take also, well, I have many more arguments against our preoccupations with inequality. If we say inequality is the problem, we have to be prepared to say how much inequality is acceptable, if at all. So on what grounds can we say up to here is fine inequality? I'm puzzled by these kind of deficiencies in the analysis of inequality. So ultimately I say, yeah, inequality can be a problem if it leads to social privilege, but there are mechanisms that translate more wealth into social privilege. For instance, the electoral sponsorship of campaigns in the US. That's a mechanism. So let's look at the mechanisms that translate wealth into social privilege. Also, inequality becomes a social problem when it is our only source of security. And in our societies, this is effectively, as the welfare state has depleted, the commons, less money invested in healthcare, you have to rely on your own wealth to take care of essential stuff. So what I'm proposing is actually to take the concern with inequality as a symptom that something else is going on, the symptom of this precarization of everybody, the symptom that we have depleted the public, the commons to such an extent that whether our societies are equal or unequal, this is not the point.
So you're arguing the inverse, which is to say that inequality is a symptom of precarity. So treat precarity first and then address inequality.
But I would agree something with my colleague here that we need to study the link between precarity and inequality. Maybe that is the next step in social science to investigate this.
Please.
I fully agree. And in fact, I think there are already quite a bit of studies on that link. For instance, the work of Emmanuel Saez and Raj Chetty in the US show, a very strong relationship between precisely your position in your income, in your income rank, or more precisely, the income rank of your parents, and your probability of accessing higher education in the US. So basically, if you're in the bottom 20% of the income ladder, if your parents are in the bottom 20%, you'll have 20% chances to go to college in the US. If you're a little higher, so bottom 40%, you'll have 40%, at the top of the bottom 40%, you'll have 40% chances to get to college. If you are the very top of the scale, you'll have close to 100% chances to access college. So there is a very strong correlation between exactly your position in the income scale and your chances to get access to good quality education. So I think this is a very strong argument in favor of looking at inequality and of understanding inequality as one of the things that is going to determine your life chances and to determine if you have access to these basic things which create precarity. That's one thing. Another, I think it's colleagues from the UK, epidemiologists, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, who look at how unequal societies are. And here I'm not, comparing Soviet or, former communist societies, or let's just look at European societies, Japan, the US, Australia, and countries over $40,000 of income and that are market democracies, basically. And what they find is that the more inequality there is in these societies, the more diseases there are in this society. In particular, things like obesity, things like heart diseases, certain types of cancers, which are also associated to inequality through the channel of stress. And I think this is also related to what Albena was saying at the beginning, because there is this feeling of insecurity. But this feeling of insecurity is not just because you are below a certain absolute level, which would say that you're in precarity or not. No, it's stress throughout the entire income scale, because if you're at the bottom, you fear that you will fall below and you would like to be above. If you're at the middle, you fear of going below, but you would also be, like to be above. If you're at the very top, you will look down and you will see a lot of people that are trying to get up, and this will also create stress. So inequality matters also for health reasons. And final point, again, back to the Warren Buffett argument. Inequality matters because in unequal societies, it's harder to collectively agree to finance what economists call public goods, education and health. Why? Because the rich can provide for themselves for these goods. If I'm Warren Buffett, I can pay, education to my kids. I can have my private hospital. I can have my private airline. I can have my private library. So I don't need collective funding of these goods. And that is something that you see in very unequal societies. So again, the point is not to, level up all incomes. I've barely seen, anybody say that in current contemporary debates about inequality. The point is to realize that current levels of inequalities in market, economies are much higher than they were 40 years back. And this means a very different form of capitalism. This means a very different way of doing politics. And this means that it's much harder to lift people out of precarity.
I think it's important to note, Lucas, that in your definition of inequality, it's broader than just economic inequality, right? You're talking about, you just mentioned health, education. You talk also about gender, nationality. I mean, how vast is your kind of working definition of inequality? And we'll go to Albena.
Just one word on that.
Yes.
When we study economic inequality, we look at one indicator, but indeed, the conception of what the underlying problem is broader than that. But I think it is not right to say that this single indicator should not be looked at because it doesn't matter. No, I think it's very connected, economic inequality, to these various facets of social inequality in general.
And just as I asked Albena to kind of ground her use of precarity in kind of tangible examples, I'm not going to ask you the same thing because I think we can kind of see it in our society, but I do have some statistics from your very recent World Inequality Report from this year. It was just published. If you haven't seen it online, I would recommend having a look at it. It's urgent and shocking. So here are some kind of statistics. So the richest 10% of the global population currently takes 52% of the global income, whereas the poorest half of the population earns 8.5% of it. On average, an individual from the top 10% of the global income distribution earns 200,000 euros, so 122,000 US dollars per year, whereas an individual from the poorest half earns 2,800 euros or $3,920. And then you also distinguish, so that's kind of on an individual basis, you also distinguish this idea of kind of global wealth inequalities, which is to say the poorest half of the world and the richest half. You argue, or you show kind of statistically that these inequalities are even more pronounced. Again, we're thinking kind of economically here. The poorest half of the global population, you show, barely owns any wealth at all, possessing just 2% of total wealth. And by contrast, the richest 10%, which is to say us, of the global population, owns 76% of all wealth.
Perhaps just one little point here, that was global level, right? But in rich societies, and I think this is also going to connect to the book, in rich societies, there is a half of the population. So if you look at France, or if you look at the US, that owns close to nothing. So that doesn't have, housing, that has, perhaps three to 10,000 euros as deposits, but that's all. And so if you look at the US, or if you look at France or the UK, the bottom half of the population owns 3, 4, or 5% of the total. And I think, so this is extremely important for our understanding of these dynamics here. And again, I think this is why inequalities matter. If the bottom 50% has so little, it's because the wealth is very unequally distributed. And so inequality matters. So I'd be very interested to have your point on that.
Now, a few things. You know, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, in his book on inequality, observes that the poor suffer because they don't have enough, not because others have more and some obscenely much. Now, wealth, and I'm not an economist, so I'm surprised that I will have to make that point. It is like the textbooks of introductory classes in economics. Wealth is not something to be distributed. First, it is something to be produced. So we live in a system that is set up to produce that wealth according to certain mechanism that, for instance, gratifies effort, education, investment, risk, etc., etc. It produces wealth. It produces wealth that is unequally distributed. It is in the very logic of the system. Now, if we do not like the system, we have to also agree that we might damage the wealth production as we equalize that. Now, the issue from the point of view of the poor is to make sure that when they become relatively less poor, if we redistribute, they do not become absolutely more poor as we deprive them of certain resources. So are we talking about poverty? Are we talking about inequality? Because they're not directly correlated. And the devil is, of course, in the detail. We might have a context where, because the rich have too much, the poor, there is not enough for the poor. But that's not, I mean, that's basic economic knowledge, that they're not directly correlated. Now, these statistics that we heard, they're indisputable. Indisputably, if you look at these beautiful tables, you will see the Nordic countries and Japan on the one side, they're the most equal. People are healthy, less, so better health, better mental health, better physical health. And then on the other side, you have typically the US and Portugal. But if you start looking at what's, the picture in Japan, it is probably not because of less inequality. If you look at the Japanese, they have a universal healthcare insurance, universal healthcare system. All residents of Japan, all residents, not just the nationals, by law are obliged to take medical insurance. There is a lifetime employment in Japan. So these are the anti-precarity factors that explain to me the good physical and mental health rather than levels of inequality.
Let's just address your first point, which is to say, and maybe you can address this. I mean, yeah, I would like you to address it, which is why attack the rich? Why focus on attacking the rich, the 1%, and why not focus on helping the 99%?
I think, we should do both. Basically, you cannot, the situation was pretty different 50 years back. But, currently, what amount of extra production can we make without, completely burning planet Earth? So there might be limits to, further production we can make, further wealth we can, the wealth we knew how to create. We need to invent new forms of wealth creation in terms of, production, basic production. It's unclear how much more we can produce.
So you're talking about restructuring our economic system.
So if there's a limit to how much more we can produce, we cannot use economic growth as, the tool through which we will provide more for the working class, for the bottom of the distribution. So to some extent, there needs to be some redistribution, some rethinking of how the cake is shared rather than how we're increasing the full size of the cake. That's partly how the two things are connected. But the other way these are connected is through political power relationships. And actually, I'd like to come to the third moment of reading this book. I told you that I had three moments. First agreement, then disagreement, and third, that there was a basically broad agreement. Because when I came to chapter 7, last chapter, recommendations,
getting unstuck,
what to do, I was in agreement with everything. Basically everything. So first thing you say, we do need to tax the rich. And it's a good point to start. So, and so then I was a bit in a misunderstanding. Is it connected to what I was reading before? Because I thought that we should not talk about inequality and taxing the rich, but in the end, it's the first point that.
But let me tell you what I'll do when I tax the rich.
And then, what do we do with that? We use it to solve the precarity problem.
Right.
So I also agree with that.
Right.
And then you also say that we need to bring democracy within the firm. So that's to address power inequalities, decision-making inequalities. Also agree. And final thing, unemployment guarantee. Fully agree with that. So, and by the way, if we read a book like, Thomas Piketty, his latest book, Capital and Ideology, you are going to see exactly these three big pillars of, the new left, so to say. Taxation, but also, redistributing power within the firm. And third, some new basic guarantee system. So broad agreement. So that's where I was at the same time very happy and in a bit of a misunderstanding of why we need this segment of disagreement to reach to the same conclusions.
But before we turn to Albena, I would just ask you, Luca, would you add anything to, since we are kind of turning to the more solution-based part of the conversation, what would you add to those 3 points from your perspective?
I would add the environmental dimension in the sense that, burning planet Earth needs to be factored in our understanding of inequalities today. And so environmental degradation is the new horizon of social justice and social injustice. So climate change, if we don't do anything, is going to further, exacerbate inequality levels and precarity levels. But why also inequality? Because I don't know who of you watched Don't Look Up. I guess many of you. Well, some people, who are very wealthy actually don't care that much about solving the problem or not, because they have this spaceship that can, go to in other planets.
Mars, exactly.
And in fact, this is already the case. Basically, if you go to Kansas desert in the US, you can buy for about 100 million euros luxury loft that will protect you in the case of a collapse of civilization. In this loft, you have a private army, you have a private hospital, you have private pool, and you have fake LED windows that project, whatever you want to see outside. This is real.
Have you been there?
No, but I've seen it. Very interesting, and you can see they have a very nice website for those who are interested in that. So basically, it is also a metaphor. But just to say that this film, I think, and the metaphor of the very rich, we're very close to there. The minority not seeing the extent of the problem because it thinks that it will not be impacted as much as a big part of the population. So again, I think inequality matters here, and the environment is what I would add, and environmental policies to also address this inequality crisis.
And of course, that's what you work on. I mean, that's why.
And I also do work on
right. So we're gonna talk about that. Albena.
Yeah. So economic democracy, worker involvement, tax the rich. All this, yes, these are the common points that the left makes, but I'm saying that this is not enough. And let me explain why this is not enough. You make workers, you nationalize companies, even if you want. You make workers involved in decision-making, but you operate in a context of a global competition for profits. So we see China, it's a communist country that functions as a big capitalist. Even if workers own their companies, they will behave in the global economy as capitalists in the pursuit of profit, of growth, of reinvestment, of self-exploitation, etc. So in our particular context, those old fixes that were the typical socialist agenda don't work because of global economic competition. The environment, very dear topic to me. We are on the same page here. However, I want to observe something, that we cannot both grow and redistribute in order to reduce inequality and save the environment. So the old formula of the welfare state of inclusive prosperity, it sounds great, but we are past that. That train is gone. What we need to strive for, if we want to both, achieve the social justice agenda and the ecological justice agenda, we have to switch from what I call inclusive growth to solidarity in well-being. And part of the well-being is to give people stability rather than more affluence. Stop promising affluence to people. You know, we are going to eat our existence away. So I think that we need to give people something, so replace affluence with stability.
And you call this the political economy of trust.
Yes.
And broadly speaking, your political economy of trust breaks down into two main points you make in the chapter that Luca pointed out, chapter 7, Getting Unstuck: recasting globalization on the first hand and recasting domestic policy on the second. Would you like to say a bit more?
Well, recasting globalization, actually, I must say this already the European Commission has been doing it. Great surprise, great delight. For instance, with the European Green Deal, this is going actually against a lot of the disagreements, both from the workers and employers, because they're worried about jobs, they're worried about this change. As I said, people are very conservative because they're scared. But, you know, the European Commission has been pushing against all odds, I would say, with the European Green Deal, and they are doing things like trying to put in law higher labor and environmental standards for the products that are coming to the European market, so that all the world can implement, you know, higher labor and environmental standards. So this is really the way not to, you know, shut down our economies, you know, not to stop globalization, but change it, make it, you know, more demanding in terms of labor and environmental standards.
And domestic policy?
So domestic policy there, now I go against two fashionable ideas. One is job creation. I agree there with the thinker, economist, anthropologist, David Graeber. He wrote a beautiful book about bullshit jobs. We don't need any more bullshit jobs.
What are some examples of bullshit jobs?
Well, administrative jobs are mostly about innovation. We've been innovated out of, we cannot cope with innovation anymore, but people are paid to innovate. So we are bombarded with more and more, and every day something new. So bullshit jobs are not the solution, because our societies, I'm talking about Western capitalist democracies, have reached a point where, thanks to science, automation, we can produce our well-being, our and the necessary wealth with very little input of labor, so we can all work less. So the other thing, idea I reject is universal basic income. In fact, at some point I thought it's a good idea. Piketty, for instance, Thomas Piketty has proposed that each of us, when we hit age 25, we get 120,000 euro. Well, I'd rather put that money into a robust education, housing, healthcare, build up the commons, because the pot is not limitless. You know, you have to make a choice. So the solution I would rather embrace is voluntary employment flexibility. So don't push people into bullshit jobs, but allow people to work less. And that can be achieved with specific policies. Yes.
I'm looking at the time, and I'm aware that there might be questions in the room or on Zoom. Before we turn to questions, I'd like to just ask both of you a kind of broad question about how you think your work in academia kind of intersects with the real world, as it were. I mean, it's not as if academia isn't the real world, but the kind of everyday life, let's say. And I'm departing from the award that Albana's book won, called the American Political Science Association's award in 2021, the Michael Harrington Book Award, which recognizes, and I'm quoting, an outstanding book that demonstrates how scholarship can be used in the struggle for a better world. Luca, let's start with you. How do you think scholarship can be used in the struggle for a better world? What is the relationship of scholarship and academia to bunkers in America, for example?
Well, you know, I think that deep down the project of university, which is cosmopolitanism and knowledge for a better world. So which is about, learning from disagreements, learning from debates, and standing on the shoulders of giants to, see further. This is what scholars are trying to do. And this is what scholars have been doing for hundreds and thousands of years. And I think that, broader in society, we also need to have this kind of approach to problems. So we look at problems and we try to learn from diverging, competing opinions and competing views of these problems based on method. So method, different competing opinions, and then learning from disagreements and reaching always to a better understanding of the situation. And that's what scholars, university provides. And that's what we need more in our societies, where we tend to compete on our views about everything. And so we need to recreate some common understanding, common views. And I think that, the scientific method in social sciences is very well placed to do that. One problem is that for decades, researchers have been just working in their ivory towers, a lot of them. And here I'm thinking largely about economists who have developed very complex models of the world. And then they were not talking to society, they were just talking to policymakers, saying that our very, very complex models that you can't understand because you're not clever enough are just fit for the world as it is. In fact, they were not fit for the world at all. And if you open up the black box, you understand that there is some treachery here. And I think that what we're trying to do, so what Albena is trying to do, what we're trying to do from a different discipline is really open up scholarship research, open up the black box so that everybody can make up their own mind about what actually this is about. So when we produce these inequality statistics, when we have, some analysis, some proposals, we really try to publish everything online. And we really try to, write also books like, that everybody can read so that everybody can really try to understand what this is about. And this is a different way to see research as compared to what has been done for many decades, at least in economics. Again, there was this very technocratic approach to social science. So I think the role today is really to open up and to continue this open up, and it can help solve many of the fragmentation problems in societies today.
Okay, I'm going to get to you. I want to respond to the first part of your answer, Luca, because it seems to me that certainly a critique, I went to university in America, so it was more kind of rampant there. But the university campus is no longer a place of conflicting ideas. In fact, it's a place of left-wing students who are not coming up against any other ideas apart from the ones that they espouse. What would you say to that critique, that the university campus is no longer a place of conflicting and converging ideas, at least in America?
I think it's, a very well executed strategy of the far right to discredit and destabilize, university and academic research. And what I'm afraid about is that this is now coming in France. And now you have, a lot of people who say, look at Sciences Po, for instance, it's just about, wokeism. Look at this university, they're, full of Islamo-leftists. And I think this is really what happened in the US debate, where you had the far right, well organized, with a clear strategy to try to discredit the scientific method, basically, in social sciences. But I think if you really look at what's happening, you see a lot of diversity in research and diversity in the type of thinking within the left. You also see a lot of right-wing research or right-wing inspired research, and that's good.
Okay, fantastic. Albena, to you, and then we will have questions.
Okay. I don't think the issue is about the clash of perspectives, because if we have two sclerotic versions of the left and the right clashing, there is not much interest in that. What's important is that academia avoids the cliches, avoids the doctrines, avoids the ideology, and there is a fresh thinking that comes from observations of people's struggles with everyday life. So I would rather appeal for academia to be less ideological, whether left or right or, yeah. I'm a political theorist. The greatest ideas in political theory have always been born not in the classrooms, but out of response to specific grievances, specific problems. And this is the kind of science we need to keep producing.
Okay, thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause, please, for both Alvena and Luca? Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Are there any questions in the room? Start. Yes.
Okay. I heard that this discussion today, it's more based on the Western world. How about China? Does it work over there? It's a totally different system. It's the biggest population in the world, and it's the future. And how does it work, your model?
Well, I confine my investigations to what I know, and this is Western capitalist democracies. So I have indeed nothing to say about China. I could share some views, but that is not what I do in the book.
No, I think it's an essential part of also the method that we try to apply to our look at social sciences and at inequalities, these international comparisons. And so we've been doing quite some research on China and also on India. And I think it's interesting to compare these two countries and also to inform the debate we're having today about precarity. In China, since the mid-2000s onwards, there has been a stabilization of their inequality levels. And between 1978 and the mid-2000s, you actually see a country that opens up, that deregulates, that privatizes a big parts of its economy, and that sees a big rise of inequality. But since the mid-2000s, actually, what the government was doing is investing a lot in infrastructures in rural areas, roads, schools, and health centers. And so the consequence of that is limited inequality levels. In India, I agree with what Albina was saying, that sometimes inequality can be a consequence of precarity, or less inequality can be a consequence of less precarity. And that's what we observe in China since the mid-2000s. In India, it's really not the same thing. Basically, the Indian governments did not invest in these basic things, roads, public schools, in rural areas. And so in India, over the same period of time as China, so India also deregulates a lot and privatizes a lot since the mid-1980s. And you see a continued rise of inequality to the extent that it might now be very difficult for the Indian society to basically do these investments, because you have these situations of power lockages, high economic inequality, high political inequality, and then, it's a vicious cycle. So I think it's very interesting, how in China basically, but I think it's also related to, at some point, the fear of the government that too much inequality might destabilize the system.
Can I just add something? It's important to understand that a precarity is about disempowerment. So the opposite of precarity is not economic stability. The root of, the etymology of the word comes from the Latin precarious, which means something obtained through prayer or charity. So when we're at the mercy of a dictatorship's will, we are precarious. So maybe China is fighting inequality, it is stabilizing the commons, that's great. But if you live in a political dictatorship, you're precarious.
And I mean, indeed, fully agree on that. So let me precise. I was mentioning here economic precarity. Yeah. And of course, the political system in which you live is going to constrain, in China, the absence of basic rights, voting rights, freedom, just to say what you want, to think what you want.
Great. Any other questions in the room? We have quite a few on Zoom, but I would like to reward people for coming out in person. No? Okay.
So,
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that you wrote about what you know about, which are these advanced Western, wealthier, industrialized societies. I actually think would be very interesting to hear more from you about your understanding of precarity and the former Soviet system. I know you're from Bulgaria, and to me, the issue of precarity versus economic precarity and the political implications of that are extremely important. And I don't think you talked enough about it in the book. And as an old Soviet hack myself, I really would have appreciated better understanding some of that. And I know you have something to say about it. Maybe it's the next book.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I've been actually avoiding writing about Eastern Europe. I'm too close to it, but it's time for that book to come out. Yes, so precarity under the old regime, and I call it the old regime because they called themselves communists, but they were hardly communists. Yeah, they just appropriated their label, unfortunately. So under the dictatorship, there was so much social privilege, although there was economic equality relatively, but it was the social stratification was rather extreme. So I would say, and then to be at the whim of the central committee of the party, that was extreme political precarity. So in principle, you have to think about the economic, the social and the political factors of precarity. And I would say there, economically, yes, we were, we had a good education, healthcare system, fair healthcare system. So these things were in place, but there were other drivers of precarity. Yeah.
Great. I just want to get to one question on Zoom. We've had quite a few questions about the relationship between capitalism and democracy. We've talked about politics over the course of the evening. This is a question from Christopher Buha, although it highlights other questions that have been posed. They ask, I'll pose this to both of you, how does capitalism need to change in order for democracies to more fully function as actual democracies, be it in the US or other alleged democracies around the world? Luca, let's start with you.
how does capitalism needs to change?
Yes.
Well, you know, that's a big question for 1 minute.
Yeah,
answer.
30 seconds, please.
Well, you know, I think that if we start again with the 3 pillars at the end of the book, you know, let's just get our taxation system straight. And I think that in the web of difficult things to do in front of us, this is a difficult thing, but it's perhaps not the most difficult thing to do. And we should start with that. Then let's democratize, you know, power within firms. And then the question is how much, to what extent? And this raises many important questions. I would like us to discuss more about that in the current French election campaigns and, you know, identity politics. And this is also where I fully agree with Albina that, you know, the debate is focusing on scapegoating the foreigners because we're not talking about the real problems. And third, I would also say that, yeah, pillar 3, you know, employment guarantee. And if we're doing that, I think we'll solve, you know, a big bunch of the problems that our societies are facing and that also our political systems are going through.
Lena,
Okay.
final word.
Yeah, I would suggest that we diminish as much as possible the considerations of the profit motive in important decisions about society. I'll give one specific example. In 2017, the European Commission proposed that we develop vaccines against viruses like the coronavirus. That was within an entity called Innovative Medicine Initiative. Which is a private-public venture between the European Commission and Big Pharma. And Big Pharma said, no, thanks, because we cannot make profit. And then the European Commission didn't follow up. This is an example of when the profit motive should not play into a consideration by a public authority taking important decisions. So we need to eliminate these kind of mechanisms. Second, I teach a class about capitalism and democracy. Take my class.